Look at you. The housekeeper's son on his knees fixing my father's car for what, $40? You actually think that makes you somebody, Marsh? You'll always be exactly what your father was. Nothing. The words came down from the top of the marble steps before Caleb Marsh had even finished tightening the last bolt. Grant Ashford stood there in a cashmere sweater, the color of money, a crystal tumbler of scotch catching the porch light, flanked by two friends whose laughter arrived a half-second late, the lazy, complicit laughter of people who had never once felt the cold. Caleb crouched beside the open hood of a 1967 Mustang fastback that belonged to Grant's father. He did not look up right away. He let the silence stretch 1 second too, the way a man learns to hold his breath so a scream doesn't escape. Then he rose slow and deliberate, wiped his hands on a rag that had been white a decade ago, and looked Grant Ashford directly in the eye. He said nothing. For a man like Grant, that silence was worse than any comeback. It carried a dignity that no amount of family money could purchase, and it made his skin crawl. Nothing to say, Grant sneered, swirling the scotch. Figures. Dogs don't bark when you're the one feeding them. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The word landed in Caleb's chest like a car door slamming shut too hard. He thought of his father's name, Marsh, a name Grant had just dragged through the dirt without knowing the first thing about what it had once meant. He thought of his mother, Diane, who had spent 20 years on her knees scrubbing the floors of this very house so that he, Caleb, could eat 3 meals a day. His jaw tightened. Down at his sides, his fists trembled with an anger he refused to let out. He closed his toolbox slowly, one latch at a time, with an almost reverent care, as though each calm, controlled motion were a small victory clawed back from humiliation. "The car's fixed, Mr. Ashford," he said finally, his voice low, polite, almost too gentle for the storm rolling behind his ribs. "Have a good evening." He turned and walked away. Behind him, Grant's laughter spread out across the driveway like oil on wet pavement. Caleb did not turn around. He had learned since he was a boy that looking back never changed anything. It only gave the pain more time to settle in deeper. Outside, a November wind came howling off Lake Michigan, cutting through the bare trees that lined the Ashford's private road on the outskirts of Grosse Pointe. Caleb pulled the collar of his coat up around his neck, a coat that had belonged to someone else, first too wide in the shoulders, too short at the wrists, and started walking. He didn't have bus fare. He rarely did. It was a 40-minute walk back to the small apartment he shared with his mother in a corner of Detroit's east side, where the radiator clicked on only when the electric meter allowed it. The cold bit into his bare hands. He shoved them into his pockets, where his fingers found the folded bills he'd earned that evening, enough maybe for a loaf of bread and a little milk. His stomach twisted not just from hunger, but from something older and more familiar, the quiet shame of counting every dollar before he dared to spend it. He thought of the winters of his childhood, when his mother would shut off the heat to save what little they had and pile every blanket in the house onto him, staying wrapped in nothing but a thin shawl herself. He remembered his own thin body back then. The night's sleep never came because the cold seeped in through windows that didn't seal right, the wind rattling the shutters like it wanted to tear the whole apartment apart. He remembered being afraid of winter, afraid of tomorrow, afraid he would never find a way out of that life. He passed a diner on Gratiot Avenue, its windows fogged gold with warmth, the smell of coffee and frying onions drifting out into the cold despite the closed door. He stopped for a moment without meaning to, staring at a couple laughing over plates of food through the glass. He didn't let himself go in. He knew that particular hunger too well, the kind he had learned very young to fold up and store somewhere deep beneath a layer of dignity he wore, like armor. A woman stepped out of the diner with a to-go bag, brushing past him without a word of apology, hurrying toward the warmth of her car. Caleb lowered his head and kept walking, his shoulders a little more stooped than before. When he reached his building, he looked up at the second-floor window where a thin light trembled behind a worn curtain. His mother was waiting the way she always was, despite the exhaustion, despite the ache in knees that had spent 2 decades on other people's floors. He breathed in the frozen air, wiped every trace of the scene at the Ashford estate from his face, and put on the fragile smile he always kept just for her, so she would never have to carry on top of everything else. the weight of his humiliation. That night as he walked, an old question came back to haunt him the way it always did. Whenever Grant said his father's name with that same quiet contempt, who had his father really been? His mother never talked about it for long. A good man was all she'd ever say, who died too young and too poor. Caleb had never pushed. He was afraid, without ever admitting it to himself, that the truth might hurt worse than the silence. The next morning, on the other side of the city, in the hushed, book-lined study of a lakefront mansion overlooking the Detroit River, a very different kind of silence reigned, heavy, clinical, almost sacred. Robert Whitmore, 74 years old, founder and chairman of Whitmore Motor Company, stood motionless beside a hospital bed that had been installed in what used to be his granddaughter's bedroom. Grace Whitmore, 26 years old, had been asleep for 2 years, in a sleep no one could promise she would ever wake from. A car accident on an icy stretch of highway one winter night had stolen her consciousness without taking her life. Her face on the white pillow held an almost peaceful stillness, a beauty suspended, as if caught somewhere between two worlds. "Doctor, tell me the truth," Robert murmured, without taking his eyes off the sleeping face. "Is she ever coming back?" The doctor, standing a few steps away, hesitated before answering. "Mr. Whitmore, we've tried everything. Detroit, Boston, the Mayo Clinic. Her body is stable. Her mind isn't responding anymore. The odds of her waking up go down a little more with every month that passes." Robert closed his eyes. For one fraction of a second, he saw her again as a little girl racing through the factory floor at Whitmore Motor Company, fascinated by the roar of an engine test bay, asking 1,000 questions about every piston and gasket. He had trained her himself, hoping she would one day carry the family legacy forward. And now he watched her, a prisoner of a silence no fortune could buy back, no success could redeem. "Leave us," he said quietly. Once the door closed, the old man stood still for a long time. Then slowly he crossed to the walnut writing desk in the corner of the room and drew out an old cedar box, the one where his late wife Eleanor had kept her most private letters. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a yellowed sheet of paper, the handwriting fine and slanted. "Robert," it read, "if misfortune should ever fall upon our child or our child's child, remember this. Somewhere out there is a man born on the very same day as her, carrying a goodness the world has not yet recognized. He alone will know how to bring her back to the light. Don't try to understand why I believe this. Just believe it on the day reason is no longer enough." Robert had read that letter dozens of times over the years, always with the same tender skepticism of a man of numbers and machines, a man with little patience for superstition. But that morning, after 2 years of failed treatments of silence, of nights spent listening to his granddaughter's steady, empty breathing reason for the first time in his life, simply was not enough. Robert Whitmore folded Eleanor's letter back along its worn creases with the careful reverence of a man closing a casket lid, and for a long moment, he simply stood at the window of Grace's room, watching the lights of Detroit flicker along the river in the cold dark. Somewhere out there in one of those thousands of houses he would never set foot in, a man might be sleeping right now, exhausted from a day of labor and quiet humiliation, with no idea that his fate had just tilted on its axis. That evening, Robert summoned Marcus Cole to the paneled study that overlooked the courtyard of Whitmore Motor Company's original headquarters. Marcus had been at Robert's side for 30 years, first as a young engineer fresh off the assembly line, later as the one man in the company Robert trusted with things that never appeared in any memo. Marcus Robert said, his voice carrying a firmness he didn't entirely feel, an emotion roughening the edges of it despite himself. "I need you to go through the birth records. Wayne County, Oakland County, Macomb County. Every hospital within 100 miles of Detroit. Find me anyone born on the exact same day as Grace." Marcus frowned, but he had known this man too long, had watched him grieve too quietly for too many months to risk adding the weight of a question to an already unbearable silence. "I'll get started first thing tomorrow, sir." Marcus gave a small nod and left the room without another word. Alone again, Robert returned Eleanor's letter to its velvet-lined box and closed the lid slowly, the way a man closes something fragile that once held the last words of someone he loved. He felt old, suddenly older than his 74 years old, with the weight of every dollar that had never bought him anything that mattered. Every decision he'd once made without a flicker of doubt, decisions that meant nothing tonight against a hospital bed and 2 years of silence. He turned back to the window toward the lights scattered across the city like a handful of stars that had fallen onto the rooftops. Somewhere out there behind one of those dim, flickering windows, a man might already be asleep, worn out from a day of work and quiet humiliation, with no idea that his whole life was about to change. 3 days were all it took Marcus Cole to work his way through the tangle of Michigan vital records. 3 days of quiet phone calls of favors called in from old friends in county clerk offices of afternoons spent hunched over microfilm in the dust-smelling basement of the Wayne County Records Building. The results fit onto a single sheet of paper which he laid on Robert's desk one morning in the same paneled study that overlooked the courtyard. Mr. Whitmore. There's exactly one person in the greater Detroit area born on the same day as Miss Grace. His name is Grant Ashford. Robert sat still for a long moment, staring at that name. A name he knew well, a family tied to Whitmore Motor Company through 30 years of business dinners and golf course handshakes. Part of him, the reasonable part, wanted to laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all, consulting an old letter believing in a prophecy only to land right back on the son of a business associate. But the other part of him, the part that hadn't slept properly in 2 years, the part that had watched his granddaughter breathe without living, could no longer afford the luxury of doubt. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "Today, if you can manage it." That same afternoon in the burgundy-draped sitting room of the Ashford estate, Robert laid out his request, with every ounce of dignity a man can summon when he is about to beg for a miracle. He spoke of Eleanor, of her letter, of the birth date of his granddaughter, who had been asleep for 2 years. He spoke above all of a marriage, a union that he believed against all reason might give Grace's shattered fate a way back. Grant slouched in a leather armchair with a glass in his hand, listened to the whole speech with a smile that widened as his astonishment gave way first to disbelief, then to open contempt. "Marry a woman in a coma," he said at last, not even giving his father a chance to step in. "You've got to be kidding me, Mr. Whitmore. I'm not about to spend my life kissing a statue. What would my friends say that I married a vegetable to get my hands on a fortune?" The silence that followed was colder than the November wind outside. Robert clenched his jaw, absorbing the humiliation with the restraint of a man long practiced at never letting his wounds show. Richard Ashford, pale, rose from his seat too quickly. "Grant, that's enough. You have no idea what you're about to cost this family. Cost us what, Dad? I'm saying no. That's final." He left the room without so much as a glance back at Robert, leaving behind a silence loaded with swallowed anger and calculations already beginning to turn in someone else's mind. Because in Vivian Ashford's head, a thought had just taken root, one she didn't yet dare say out loud, but one that in the space of a single breath would go on to seal the fate of a young man she had known since the day he was born. Later that evening, once Robert had gone, the disappointment still visible on his aging face, Vivian sat across from her husband in the dim light of their living room. "There might be another way," she murmured. "Caleb, Diane's son. What does Caleb have to do with any of this? He was born the same day as Grant. The same morning in this very house. I remember it like it was yesterday. Diane went into labor in the staff quarters just down the hall from where I was. The whole house was talking about it back then." A heavy silence settled over the room. Richard understood immediately what his wife was suggesting, and the cowardice of the idea made him hesitate. A hesitation quickly swept aside by the far larger fear of losing the Whitmore family's financial backing on which a good portion of their struggling business now depended. "If the Whitmores ever find out we sent them the housekeeper's son instead of our own, we're finished," he said under his breath. "Who's going to tell them you, me, Grant? Certainly not. And his mother will keep quiet if she knows what's good for her." They had Caleb summoned the next morning. Caleb arrived in the grand sitting room still dressed in the mechanic's coveralls he'd worn to finish a delivery for the auto shop where he worked nights on top of the engine repairs he did for extra cash during the day. His eyes, ringed with exhaustion, moved between Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, with the instinctive wariness of a man who knew this house too well to believe he'd been called in for anything good. "Caleb, you're not a kid anymore," Richard began, forcing a warmth into his voice that rang false from the first word. "We've found you. A good marriage." "A marriage," Caleb repeated, caught off guard. "You're going to marry Grace Whitmore." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Confusion rippled through Caleb first, and then almost immediately a cold, creeping understanding. Whitmore, Robert Whitmore's granddaughter. The one who's in a coma. Yes, Vivian cut in her impatience, barely masked. "You should be grateful. Plenty of people would kill for a chance like this." Caleb felt his heart tighten with a cold, familiar anger, the same anger that always surfaced whenever he felt like an object being moved around according to somebody else's convenience. "You're supposed to send the Ashford son," he said, his voice tightly controlled. "Not me. We can't send Grant. He refuses. And you think I'm just going to say yes in his place? You don't have a choice," Caleb, Vivian said, then her voice suddenly sharp as glass. "If you refuse, you and your mother are out of this staff apartment by tomorrow morning. Diane needs this roof over her head. She needs this paycheck for her medications. You know what her knees are like. You want her sleeping on the street in the middle of winter." The blood drained from Caleb's face. A wave of dizziness swept through him, that familiar sensation of the ground giving way beneath feet already too tired to stand. In a single flash, he saw his mother on her knees scrubbing a hardwood floor, her back bent from years of silent servitude, her hands cracked raw from cold water in winter. He saw the nights she coughed without complaint, refusing to see a doctor for fear of what it might cost, choosing to suffer in silence rather than add one more expense to their thin budget. He would not let her pay one more time for his own dignity. Caleb stood a long moment without answering his gaze, drifting somewhere between the crystal chandelier hanging overhead and the polished hardwood beneath his boots, the same hardwood his mother had waxed on her knees for 20 years so that other people could walk across it with their heads held high. A dull anger rose in him, tangled together with an older, more familiar fear. The fear of a boy who had grown up learning that saying no in a house like this one always cost more than saying yes. For one long second he thought about refusing outright, about walking out and taking his mother far away from Detroit, far away from people who had always looked down on them. But where would they go? With no money, no roof, with a woman whose knees could barely survive, a flight of stairs, let alone a long trip with nowhere waiting on the other end. "If I agree," he said, finally, his jaw tight, "my mother stays here. Safe. For good." "Understood." Richard Ashford answered too quickly, too relieved for the promise to carry any real weight. Caleb nodded once without another word and left the room before his voice could betray the tremor climbing up his throat. That evening he found Danny Dutch Doyle at the garage, wiping the last of the grease off his hands beside a half-finished Chevy pickup. Dutch had known Caleb since the two of them were 7 years old, back when they'd shared the same busted bicycle and the same second-hand winter coat 2 sizes too big. He listened to the whole story in silence, a rag hanging forgotten from his fingers. "You've lost your mind, Caleb. Marrying a stranger, a woman in a coma, for people who've treated you like garbage your whole life. I don't have a choice, Dutch. My mom, there's always a choice. That's what rich people want you to believe, that you don't have one. They use us, Caleb, and the second we're no use to them anymore, they toss us out like a busted wrench. I've watched them do it. I've watched you pay for it your whole damn life." Caleb looked down at his own hands, the same hands that the night before had tightened a bolt on Grant Ashford's father's Mustang for a handful of crumpled bills, while Grant hurled insults over his shoulder. He thought of his mother, of the promise he'd just made, of the enormous emptiness opening up in front of him like a door onto the unknown. "Maybe you're right, Dutch," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't have the strength left to fight the whole world, just enough to protect her." Dutch didn't answer. He simply laid a hand on his friend's shoulder, the kind of silent gesture that between the two of them had always meant more than any words could. A gesture that said without saying it, "I'll be here no matter what happens," while outside night settled over Detroit, cold, indifferent, heavy with promises neither man dared imagine yet. The night before the wedding, the small apartment on the east side felt smaller and colder than usual. Diane Marsh had pulled 2 battered suitcases from the back of the hall closet, suitcases that had traveled through an entire life of modest moves, and was folding with an almost ceremonial slowness. The few decent clothes her son owned, a shirt she had pressed 3 times to smooth out every crease, a pair of pants she had taken in herself over the years. So much weight had Caleb lost since he was a teenager. "You don't have to do this, Mom," he said gently, sitting on the old couch, elbows on his knees, his gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. "I can pack my own things. Let me do it, son. This is the last time I get to pack your bags for a real departure." There was a sadness in her voice she no longer bothered to hide. Caleb watched her, that thin frame bent by years of labor, those cracked hands folding fabric with an almost desperate tenderness, and felt his throat tighten. He thought of everything this woman had sacrificed for him, meals skipped so he could eat winters without heat, humiliations swallowed in silence inside the Ashford house, and he promised himself once more that she would never again pay the price of his own dignity. It was while searching for a scarf at the bottom of the old wooden chest that had always sat in the corner of his room, a piece of furniture. He had never had the curiosity, or maybe the courage, to open all the way that Caleb came across a small metal case hidden beneath a stack of worn sheets. He pulled it out, startled by its unusual weight, and lifted the creaking lid. Inside lay a set of vintage tools, worn but beautifully maintained fine-tipped pliers, a set of tiny precision screwdrivers, a magnifying loupe mounted in brass, a notebook with a cracked leather cover. Every piece bore the same initials carefully engraved, W.M. Caleb's heart began to race. He knew those initials. He had seen them as a child on an old yellowed photograph. His mother kept hidden in a drawer, a young man with a shy smile bent over a workbench. Walter Marsh, his father. "Mom," he called, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Come look at this." Diane stepped into the room, and the instant her eyes landed on the open case, her face went still. She pressed a hand to her mouth as if to hold back a cry that had been building for decades. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. "I thought I'd given it all away," she murmured. "I thought I'd let it all go with him. Mom, who was my father, you always told me he fixed cars for a living. Just a mechanic. But this," he lifted the notebook, its pages filled with sketches of engine and transmission systems rendered with a precision that seemed to belong to another world entirely. "This isn't the notebook of just a mechanic." Diane stayed silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her own hands as if searching in their worn lines for the courage to finally say what she had kept buried for 28 years. "Your father," she said. At last, her voice trembling, was the finest automotive engineer this city has ever seen. He's the one who designed all on his own the transmission system that made Whitmore Motor Company's name back in the day. A design the whole industry admired without ever knowing whose it was. Caleb felt the floor tilt beneath him. Whitmore Motor Company. He had a business partner back then, a man with a fine name and the right connections, but not a tenth of your father's talent. When the design was unveiled to the world, it was that man who took all the credit, all the honor, all the fortune. Your father got nothing but silence. They pushed him out little by little, spread rumors about his incompetence, humiliated him in front of his own colleagues, until he didn't have the strength left to fight back. She paused, her voice breaking. "He died 3 years later, Caleb. His heart just gave out long before its time. Not any sickness a doctor could put a name to, just a man who'd had his own pride stolen from him. I remember his last weeks, the way he'd look at his own hands, the same hands that built the finest system this whole industry ever admired, wondering out loud what they'd even been good for. I never knew how to answer him. All I had was my love to give him, and it wasn't enough to keep him alive." A silence fell over the small room, thick, almost solid, broken only by the distant ticking of a wall clock in the apartment next door. Caleb was still holding the notebook, as though through that single object he could finally touch the man he had only ever known as an absence. A blurred memory surfaced, one nearly erased by time, a deep voice humming softly while rocking him to sleep, the smell of metal and machine oil mixed with soap, a broad hand laid over his own small one, teaching him how to hold a pencil. He had been 4 years old, maybe 5, and he had never known until tonight that the hand belonged to one of the finest engineers this city had ever produced. Long after his mother had gone to bed, Caleb slipped out into the cold and walked the 6 blocks to his father's old garage, the modest storage space it had become. Now the lease long since passed to someone who sold used tires out of the front bay. He didn't go inside. He simply sat down on the concrete step outside the locked roll-up door, knees drawn to his chest, and let the December air bite at his face until his breath came out in slow gray clouds. Sleep would not come tonight. Not with the notebook still burning a hole in his jacket pocket, not with his father's initials still branded behind his eyes. And somewhere beneath all of it, in a place he almost never let himself go, a memory he had kept buried for 12 years began without permission to surface. He had been 16. His sister Mia had been 9, a small, quick, endlessly talkative girl who used to sit on the workbench beside him while he tinkered with whatever engine needed fixing that week, narrating everything he did back to him as though she were the one teaching him. Their father was 2 years gone by then, and money had never once stopped being the thing the family measured every decision against. That winter, the brakes on the family's old sedan had started grinding, a low metallic whine that got worse every time his mother pressed the pedal. Caleb, who had already taught himself more about engines than most men twice his age, told his mother not to worry, he could handle it. He drove to a salvage yard on the outskirts of the city and came back with a set of aftermarket brake pads, second-hand, a fraction of the price of factory parts. He remembered telling himself it would hold until he could save up for the real thing. He remembered being proud of himself for saving the family $60. 3 weeks later, on a morning slick with black ice, his mother asked him to drive Mia to school because her own knees were too swollen to manage the clutch. Caleb never made it past the bottom of Fenkel Avenue. The brakes gave out on the downhill grade before the intersection gave out completely, no warning, no time. He remembered the sound more than anything, a sound he had never once in 12 years managed to fully silence in his own mind. He walked away with a broken wrist and a scar along his hairline. Mia did not walk away at all. He had never told anyone the truth of it, not the full truth, not even Dutch, who had sat with him through the funeral And every terrible year that followed without ever knowing that the boy beside him blamed himself for pulling the trigger on his own sister's death. His mother knew, of course. Grief like that cannot be fully hidden between two people living under one roof. But even she had never once said the words out loud, as though naming it might make it more true than it already was. Caleb had built a life brick by silent brick on top of that guilt. It was why he checked every bolt on every engine 3 times before he trusted it. It was why when Grant Ashford called him nothing in front of a crowd of laughing friends, some small buried part of Caleb almost agreed with him. And it was why whenever anyone got close enough to matter, some old cold instinct in him always found a reason to step back first, because in his experience, love was the kind of thing that could be taken from you in a single careless second, and he had learned at 16 exactly how that felt. He sat with it a long while, the cold working its way through his coat until the sky over the garage roof began almost imperceptibly to lighten from black to a bruised wintry gray. He thought of his father's hands guiding his own over a pencil. He thought of Mia's laugh. He thought of Grace Whitmore, a stranger he had never met asleep in a mansion he would be walking into by nightfall as her husband, and he wondered with a bitterness that surprised him. What kind of man carried this much wreckage into a marriage that wasn't even real? The next morning, a hard frost had settled over the east side, coating the chain-link fences and bare maple trees in a thin, glittering skin of white. Caleb stood in front of the cracked mirror in his bedroom, adjusting for the 3rd time the collar of a dress shirt that wasn't his, borrowed the night before by his mother, from a neighbor whose son was roughly Caleb's build. The fabric, too stiff and unfamiliar, chafed at the back of his neck. He didn't complain. He had learned since childhood that borrowed clothes were worn in silence. In the mirror's reflection, he saw a face he barely recognized, features drawn tight from a night without sleep, eyes ringed with an exhaustion older than mere insomnia, and somewhere far back in his own gaze something new, a quiet hardness, born of the truth he'd learned the night before that no mirror could ever erase. "You ready?" Diane asked from the doorway, her voice caught somewhere between pride and worry. "I don't get a choice about being ready," he answered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She crossed the small room, straightened his collar with a mother's practiced hand, and rested a trembling palm against his cheek. "Your father would be proud of you today. Not for this marriage, for what you're doing for me." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her hand erase just for a second the crushing weight of everything still waiting for him outside that door. The ceremony took place in the private chapel wing of the Whitmore lakefront estate, far from any guest list, any wedding photographer, any of the usual noise that came with an occasion like this. There was no music. There were no flowers beyond a single arrangement of white lilies on the altar. Only the handful of witnesses the moment required stood scattered among the pews. Robert Whitmore, his face carved with a grief he no longer bothered to hide. A physician monitoring Grace's condition from a discreet distance, and a county clerk who had come at Robert's request, visibly uncertain whether the law itself was prepared to recognize a union like this one. Grace lay in a medical wheelchair, dressed in a simple white gown that had belonged once to her late grandmother. Her face held that same pale, translucent stillness suspended somewhere between sleep and waking. Caleb stepped toward her, his heart pounding with an anxiety no amount of mental preparation had managed to calm, and leaned down, murmuring so quietly that only the silence of the room could have caught it. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I promise you one thing: I will never take advantage of your sleep." The clerk recited the necessary words. Caleb answered, "I do," in a voice that did not shake despite the dizziness rising in him, that same old familiar sensation of losing his footing in a life that no longer quite felt like his own. A plain gold band was slid onto his finger, cold against his skin. He looked at that unfamiliar ring, catching the pale winter light through the chapel's stained glass, a symbol of a bond neither of them had chosen, and felt his stomach twist with a mixture of shame and vertigo. Through the high window, a single shaft of sunlight cut across the dusty glass and came to rest on Grace's motionless face, catching a drift of dust suspended in the air, as if the light itself hesitated to settle on a union built on so much silence. Robert, standing off to the side, wiped away a tear he made no effort to hide. For him, this marriage was not a lie. It was the last hope of an old man who refused to bury his granddaughter alive. That night, in the vast bedroom that had been assigned to him, a room larger on its own than the entire apartment he shared with his mother, Caleb stood for a long while in front of the canopy bed, where Grace lay watched over by a night nurse, who slipped out quietly once she'd checked the monitors, closing the door behind her without a sound. He looked at the embroidered linen sheets, the velvet curtains, the fire crackling low in the marble fireplace, a kind of luxury so overwhelming It felt almost painful, set against the cold that only the night before had still been seeping in through his own bedroom window. For a moment, he thought about lying down, worn out from days without real rest. Then his eyes drifted back to Grace's sleeping face, and something settled in him, simple and unshakable. He crossed to the foot of the bed, took the folded blanket resting there, and lowered himself onto the hardwood floor, his back against the wall a few feet from the woman who now carried his last name without knowing it. "You didn't choose any of this," he murmured into the dark, as much to himself as to her. "Until you can tell me yes or no, I'll stay right here, on the floor. It isn't much, but it's the only honest thing I have to offer you." He closed his eyes, and in the quiet he thought back to the cold winters of his childhood, the drafty floorboards, the wind slipping under doors that never quite sealed, right, and found in the bitter irony of the moment something almost like comfort. Sleeping on the floor, at least, was a language he already knew by heart. The next morning, Robert Whitmore walked in quietly to check on his granddaughter and found the scene waiting for him. A young man curled beneath a single blanket on the hardwood floor, while an entire untouched bed sat empty just a few feet away. He stood a moment in the doorway, silent, watching this young man in worn clothes with calloused hands, who had just turned down the most basic comfort a person could ask for, out of nothing more than simple decency. "You could have slept in the bed, son," he said gently once. Caleb jolted awake, sat up, embarrassed to be caught like this. "She didn't give me permission, Mr. Whitmore. I didn't want to take something from her she doesn't even know she's giving." Robert stayed quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on this young man in threadbare clothes with the calloused hands of a working man who had just refused the most basic comfort out of nothing more than plain decency. Something in that quiet humility moved him more deeply than he would have thought possible. "Here's your monthly allowance," he said, holding out an envelope. "There are also car keys in the entryway drawer. Pick whichever one you like." Caleb looked at the envelope without reaching for it right away, as though his own arm refused to obey. "I can't accept all this, sir. You're my granddaughter's husband now. Nobody in this house is going to look down on you. If people see you struggling, they'll say I took in a son-in-law and treated him poorly. I won't allow that." Caleb lowered his eyes, his throat tight with an emotion he hadn't expected. Not simple gratitude, but something more complicated, almost painful. The dizzying sensation of being treated for the first time in his life with a respect he had never had to beg for. He thought, without meaning to, of Walter Marsh, of this very industry that had once destroyed his father, and he wondered with a confused mix of shame and doubt whether he even had the right to accept any kindness coming from it. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," he said finally, his voice rough. A few days later, Dutch came by to see him visibly uneasy, in the enormous entrance hall, throwing wary glances at the framed oil paintings lining the walls. Caleb told him in a low voice about Robert's generosity, the gifts he'd turned down the night spent on the floor out of respect. "The more they give you, the more they chain you," Caleb. Dutch said, his face closed off. "You think it's kindness. I see an old man buying your loyalty one gift at a time so you never think to ask questions. It's not the same thing, Dutch. It's exactly the same thing. I watched you come home from the Ashfords with bruises on your soul that nobody else could see. I don't want to watch you come home from this house wearing golden chains you won't even feel." Caleb didn't answer. He thought of the toolbox hidden in his own closet, of the promise made to his mother, of the fragile balance between gratitude and suspicion he now had to carry every single day inside a house that carried, without knowing it, a debt far older than this marriage of convenience. Outside, snow had begun falling over the rooftops of Detroit, silent, slowly wrapping the city in white, as if the sky itself were trying for one night to erase every truth no one in that house was ready to face yet. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Caleb found himself slipping into a routine he never could have imagined for himself. Mornings spent at Grace's bedside, watching her still face, learning to talk to someone who might or might not be listening somewhere behind the silence. Afternoons spent doing small jobs around the estate grounds. He had insisted on making himself useful, rather than sitting idle brushing off Robert's protests each time. And evenings alone in a corner of the library, sketching mechanisms he never dared show to anyone. He had learned, without ever admitting it out loud, to speak to Grace the way a person speaks to someone who might be listening from somewhere behind a curtain of sleep. He told her about the cold winters of his childhood, about the inventions he used to sketch at night because sleep never came easily, about his father's name, which he still didn't know how to carry. He never got an answer back, only the steady, patient ticking of a small clock on her nightstand, a sound that over time had come to feel less like an absence and more like a quiet presence in the room. That particular morning looked like every other. Pale winter light filtered through the half-drawn curtains, laying faint gray rectangles across the hardwood floor. Caleb sat in the armchair beside the bed, a book open on his knees, that he wasn't really reading, when he suddenly heard the rustle of sheets. He looked up and his heart stopped. The bed was empty. A cold jolt of panic ran through him from head to foot. He shot to his feet, the book falling to the floor with a dull thud, his eyes sweeping the room in a frantic blur. The sheets, still warm, still rumpled as though a body had only just left them, only deepened his confusion. Did she fall? Did someone take her? The thoughts collided in his head with a violence that stole the breath from his lungs. I'm not a ghost. The voice, faint but perfectly clear, came from the corner of the room near the window. Caleb spun around and saw her standing, leaning against the wall, her legs trembling under the weight of a body that had gone unused for far too long, but her eyes wide open, alive, bright, with a clarity nothing had prepared him for. You, he stammered, unable to string two coherent words together, the breath knocked clean out of him by a mixture of disbelief and pure shock. You're standing. Are you done staring? She snapped, her voice rough from long silence but sharp as a blade. I'm sorry. He looked away, his throat tight, not sure anymore where to put his eyes or his hands. I'll go get your grandfather. Who are you? The question landed like a blade. Caleb froze, one hand already reaching for the door handle. I heard you, she cut in, her voice trembling with a cold fury. You said, did someone take her? Like you were waiting for me to die. No, that's not. You sound like a man who is hoping to be rid of a burden. You're completely wrong. Caleb felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, an old, well-worn injustice. Familiar, and yet still just as painful. I've been sitting beside you for weeks. You don't get to judge my intentions off 3 badly chosen words, said in a panic. 3 words I just woke up after 2 years in a coma in a strange room with a stranger standing over my bed. Forgive me if my trust doesn't come easy. The silence that followed crackled with a tension close to electric. Grace swayed slightly, one hand reaching for the wall, and Caleb, despite the icy exchange that had just passed between them, took an instinctive step toward her. Don't touch me, she said sharply before he'd even finished the motion. At least you understand that much. I only wanted to help you. Sit down. You should be careful with your strength. My strength is none of your business. I'll go get your grandfather. He's been waiting 2 years for this. He left the room almost at a run, his heart pounding with a tangle of emotions he couldn't have named, relief, shock, and a sting of humiliation he didn't have words for yet. In the hallway, he had to stop, one hand braced against the cold wall just to catch his breath. 2 years she's been asleep, and the first thing she sees of me is doubt. Some part of him, the tired part, the part worn down by a lifetime of being judged, before he'd said a word, wanted to walk out of this house right then and never come back. But he thought of his mother, of the promise made the night before the wedding, and he swallowed that flash of anger, the way he had swallowed everything else his whole life, before it could break something in him that was already cracked. Enough. Robert, alerted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, rushed toward the room himself, his heart pounding with a hope he hadn't let himself feel in months. When he found his granddaughter sitting on the edge of the bed, pale but conscious, tears rose to his eyes before he could get a single word out. Grace. My Grace. Grandpa. Her voice broke, and every ounce of coldness she'd shown, Caleb collapsed at once in front of this man whose every wrinkle she recognized without a shadow of doubt. He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms with a trembling gentleness, as though he feared she might shatter, or worse, slip back into sleep, the instant he let go. I heard your voice, she said, crying against his shoulder. So many times in the dark. I could hear you talking to me and I couldn't answer. The doctor. We need the doctor. Robert turned toward Caleb, still standing in the doorway, and his gaze lingered on him for a moment, a new look heavy with a gratitude so intense it was almost unbearable to receive. The doctor arrived within minutes, ran a quick initial exam, and confirmed, visibly stunned himself, what no medical protocol could have predicted. A steady pulse present, reflexes, full and complete awareness. This is a miracle, Miss Whitmore. I don't have another word for it. Robert, still shaken with emotion, turned to Caleb with an almost solemn slowness. It wasn't Grant who woke my granddaughter up. It was you. It might just be a coincidence, Mr. Whitmore, Caleb said, uncomfortable under the weight of that gaze. Maybe. Or maybe the letter was never about Grant at all. Maybe it was talking about you from the very beginning. Grace, still fragile, watched this exchange with a wary attention, her eyes moving between Caleb and her grandfather, without quite grasping the nature of whatever bond connected them. A question had already begun forming in her, just as sharp as the others. Why does this man have a wedding band that matches mine? She looked down at her own hand, and her blood ran cold at the sight of the ring on her finger. A ring she had no memory of choosing, let alone accepting. "Grandpa," she said slowly, her voice sharp again. "What is this ring?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Caleb felt his stomach tighten, understanding that the truth he'd been dreading for weeks was about to come out, and that none of the kindness he'd shown her since her waking would be enough to shield him from it. He looked to Robert, hoping to find some support, some explanation he wouldn't have to carry alone. But the old man, caught off guard himself by the question, sat for a moment without words, searching for a way to turn a necessary lie into a truth his granddaughter could survive hearing. "Grace," he said finally, his voice meant to be soothing but shaking with emotion, "there's a lot I need to explain to you. Things that are going to sound strange to you, maybe even unfair. But I promise you, everything that was done, it was done to save you." Grace turned her head slowly toward Caleb, this same stranger who only minutes earlier had stood at her bedside, as though he had every right to be there. She saw something in his eyes she couldn't yet name, not pure guilt, not pure innocence either, but a troubled mixture of both, the look of a man caught inside a lie he never chose to write. Outside, the cold winter wind kept sweeping over the rooftops of Detroit, indifferent to the storm that inside this quiet room was about to break loose. Robert closed the door behind the doctor once he'd gone, drew a long breath, and sat down near his granddaughter's bed. Caleb stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling, while the old man told her everything: Eleanor's letter, the search for the man born on her exact birthday, Grant's refusal, and finally the substitution. Grace's face changed as the story unfolded, moving from confusion to disbelief, then to an anger so sharp it briefly made her forget the fragility of her own body. She clutched at the sheets, her knuckles going white as if she needed something solid to hold on to in a world that had once again been pulled out from under her. 2 years of silence. 2 years where her body had gone on living without her mind ever knowing it. And now even her waking turned out to be one more thing that had been decided for her without her. "You married me off," she said, her voice flat and cold to a stranger, "while I was asleep. Without my say. Without even asking me. Grace, please try to understand. I'd run out of hope. The doctors had given up. I held on to the only thing I had left. And him." She turned to Caleb, her eyes now openly contemptuous. "He agreed to marry a stranger in a coma. For what? The money, the Whitmore name." Caleb felt that same old familiar burn of injustice rise in his chest, the same feeling he'd known since childhood of being judged before he'd ever had the chance to explain himself. He clenched his jaw, searching in the silence for the strength to answer, without letting the anger boiling inside him break loose. "I never wanted your money," he said finally, his voice level but sharp as a blade. "They threatened to throw my sick mother out on the street if I refused. I didn't have the luxury of saying no. You think that excuses the lie. I'm not looking for an excuse. I'm telling you the truth, since that's apparently what you're demanding of me and nobody else seems willing to give it to you." The silence that followed cut like broken glass. Grace looked away, her breath short, while Robert, caught between the two of them, seemed to age 10 years under the weight of the scene. "Get out," she said finally to Caleb, her voice ice cold again. "I don't want to see you today." He gave a small bow without another word, and left the room, but not before she caught for a fraction of a second something flicker in his eyes. Not shame, but an old familiar pain. The pain of a man who had spent his whole life being rejected before he ever got the chance to defend himself. A wall of silence settled between them in the days that followed. Grace, slowly regaining her strength under the doctor's watchful supervision, went out of her way to avoid any room where Caleb happened to be. He, for his part, kept living in this house that wasn't his, with the quiet discretion of a man well practiced at making himself invisible, making his own bed, waving off the household staff's offers of help, eating alone late once. Everyone else had gone to sleep. It was on a rainy afternoon, while browsing the estate's library shelves to pass the slow hours of her convalescence, that Grace stumbled almost by accident on a notebook with a worn leather cover, wedged between 2 books on a shelf. She hesitated a moment. It clearly wasn't hers, then, driven by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain to herself, opened it. What followed left her speechless. Page after page was filled with sketches, engine and transmission diagrams rendered with an almost obsessive precision, gear assemblies annotated with tiny handwritten calculations, drafts of mechanisms whose refinement rivaled anything on display in the most prestigious automotive showrooms in the Playden country. Some pages carried dates, others just hurried notes. Scrawled in the margins, the thoughts of a mind that never seemed to stop creating even in the depths of hardship. On one of the last pages, an unfinished sketch showed a mechanism she didn't recognize at first glance, a near-exact variation on a suspension system that had once been the pride of Whitmore Motor Company's earliest lineup. Very system. Her grandfather still considered the founding masterpiece of the whole company, but redrawn, reimagined, as if its author knew every one of its secrets by heart long before he could ever have seen the original blueprints. She recognized the handwriting before she even turned the last page and found beneath a sketch of an elegant new suspension linkage, a discreet signature CM Caleb. She murmured, stunned. She found him that evening in the small workshop off the estate's back gardens, a space no one had touched in years where he had quietly set up without asking anyone's permission. A modest workbench, a few borrowed tools, a single trembling desk lamp. He startled slightly at her entrance, sliding shut with a quick and almost guilty motion the drawer, where he kept his most recent sketches. "You shouldn't be on your feet this long," he said, his voice careful, professional again, as if trying to put a safe distance back between them. "I found this." She held up the notebook, and the instant her eyes met his, she caught a flicker of panic cross his face, quickly suppressed. "You drew all of this?" He hesitated, tempted to lie, to downplay it, to retreat once more into the silence that had always protected him. But something in Grace's expression, no longer hostile but genuinely curious, disarmed him despite himself. "Yes," he said simply. "You studied business administration, right? That's what my grandfather told me. So why do you draw like a career engineer? It's just a personal interest." "A personal interest doesn't produce sketches this precise, Caleb." She said his first name for the first time, and something ran down the back of his neck he couldn't quite explain. "I grew up around this industry. I've watched apprentice engineers spend years without reaching this level." He stayed quiet, torn between the urge to tell her everything: his father, the toolbox, the 12-year-old injustice, and the promise he'd made his mother, which still sat on his tongue like a stone. "You're hiding something," she said, finally, not as an accusation but simply as an observation. "Maybe," he answered, his voice low. "But not everything hidden is necessarily bad." A silence settled between them, different from the cold, brittle one of the days before, almost livable. A silence where two kinds of distrust had quietly begun, without either of them admitting it out loud, to dissolve into each other. Grace let her gaze wander over the makeshift workbench, the borrowed tools carefully lined up despite their wear, the trembling lamp casting its warm light over this corner of shadow. She understood, without needing to be told, that this place meant something to him, far beyond a simple hobby, a refuge, maybe the only one he had ever allowed himself. "You should go back inside and rest," he said finally, his voice gentler now. "It's cold out here and you're still not at full strength. Are you worried about me?" She almost smiled, the first real smile since she'd woken, brief but genuine. "I'd be worried about anyone who stands too long in an unheated workshop," he answered with a dry composure that nearly made her laugh. She closed the notebook and held it out to him, but before he could take it back, she added quietly, almost against her will, "Thank you for treating me with respect while I was asleep. My grandfather told me everything." Caleb felt his throat tighten, with an emotion he hadn't seen coming. He nodded, unable to find the words, and watched her walk back toward the main house through the snow-covered garden, her silhouette cutting a dark line against the warm glow of the lit windows. Left alone, he set his hand on the closed notebook, feeling beneath his fingers the raised texture of pages filled with dreams he had never dared show anyone. And for the first time since his father's death, he let himself hope quietly that someday someone might see in him something more than a stand-in, a replacement, a man wearing another man's name. That same week, Robert found himself watching the two of them through the tall windows of his study one morning, Grace and Caleb walking slowly along the frozen edge of the garden, their heads bent close in quiet conversation. He said nothing to either of them, but something in his chest, tight for 2 long years, loosened just slightly for the first time, and he allowed himself cautiously the smallest flicker of hope, not for the company, not for the family name, but simply for the 2 young people out there in the cold, both of them carrying more weight than anyone in this house had ever bothered to notice. Diane came to visit her son that same week, brought by Robert's own car and driver, an arrangement that had left her flustered with embarrassment the entire ride over. She found Caleb in better spirits than she'd seen him in years, though something in his eyes still carried the same old caution, the same reflex to hold himself just slightly apart from anyone who got too close. She didn't ask him about it. She had learned, raising him alone, that some doors only opened when a person was good and ready, and that pushing at a locked door only ever made the hinges more stubborn. She simply held his hands in hers for a long moment before she left the way she used to when he was small, and told him quietly that his father would have liked this house not for its size but for the quiet in it. The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful thaw. Grace, fully recovered, now took to walking the frost-covered grounds each morning, often with Caleb beside her, who had gradually let go of his guarded distance for something more natural, almost familiar. They didn't talk about love yet. The word still felt too large for whatever they were building, but a real respect had settled between them, made of shared silences and small, unspoken kindnesses. A blanket draped over her shoulders when the wind picked up a mug of hot cider made without her having to ask a laugh. Stifled one evening over some small, clumsy mistake on his part that had made her blush despite herself. She had started tentatively asking about his sketchbooks again, and he answered with more and more honesty each time, though he never once crossed the line he'd drawn for himself, the silence around his father. She could tell he was carrying something heavy, something he hadn't found the words for yet, but she had also learned through her own long sleep the patience that comes from waiting. She let it be without pushing, trusting that trust, given enough time, would come on its own. One evening, while walking Grace back toward the corporate offices attached to the Whitmore family's original riverfront plant, a wing that housed more than a century of company archives, Caleb finally gave in to a temptation that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The next day, while Grace rested at home, he went back down alone under the pretext of returning some files, and found an old archivist there, a man named Frank Delgado, who had worked for Whitmore Motor Company for nearly 40 years and whose memory people said was as reliable as any filing cabinet in the building. "Mr. Delgado," Caleb said, his voice hesitant, "did you ever know an engineer named Walter Marsh?" The old man looked up from his papers, and something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why do you ask, son? It matters to me. Please just answer." Frank closed the folder he'd been reviewing slowly, as if buying himself time to choose his words. "Walter Marsh. Yes, I knew him. A genius in his own way. He's the one who designed all by himself the suspension system that first put this company on the map. A terrible injustice followed. They took everything from him." I already know that. Caleb set his throat tight. "What I need to know is whether Robert Whitmore knew about it. Whether he knew back when Marcus Cole went looking through the birth records." The archivist's silence this time went on a beat too long to be innocent. "Mr. Delgado, Robert wasn't running the company yet back then," he said, finally low, "but he was already working alongside his father. He knew, son. He always knew what happened to Walter Marsh. I saw him myself once pull your father's personnel file out of storage in secret years ago now, well before Miss Grace's accident." Caleb felt the ground drop out from under him, that same old vertigo he knew too well, but multiplied 100-fold, as if every humiliation of his life had suddenly converged on this single point of breaking. "You're saying he knew who I was before he ever sent anyone looking for me?" "I can't say that for certain, but the name Marsh isn't a secret to anyone who's been around this company long enough, and Robert Whitmore never forgets a name." Caleb climbed the stairs back to the executive offices in a daze, his ears ringing, unable to sort the anger from the shock. He found Robert bent over some paperwork in his study, and shut the door behind him hard enough to make the old man jump. "You knew," Caleb said without preamble, his voice shaking with a rage he was barely containing. "You knew who my father was. You knew what your family let happen to him, and you still let me walk into this house without ever saying a word." Robert went pale, setting down his pen slowly. "Caleb, answer me. Did you know?" A long silence stretched out, heavier than any that had come before it. "Yes," Robert said at last, his voice breaking. "I knew." Caleb's world tilted on its axis. Then all of it, the letter, the search, this marriage, none of it was chance. It wasn't fate. It was you. You chose me. No, Caleb, listen to me. You used me to ease your own conscience. Caleb's voice cracked, releasing 12 years, no 28 years of anger. He had never let himself feel all at once. You never believed in that prophecy, did you? You just saw a name in a record and realized it was the one chance you'd ever get to make, right? What your own family destroyed, without ever having to answer for it in public. Robert rose, his hands shaking against the desk. I didn't know at first, I swear it. The search really did lead to Grant. It wasn't until his name came up in your place that I understood who you really were. And I admit, his voice broke too. I admit I hoped quietly that fate might finally give us the chance to make right what we took from you and your family. But I orchestrated none of it, Caleb. I didn't have the power to, and I didn't have the courage to either. Courage, Caleb spat, is something you never had. Not for my father. Not for me. You always chose silence as long as it spared you the shame. He felt something in him give way completely as he said it. 28 years of forced politeness, of silent deference, of swallowed anger in front of people, richer and more powerful than himself. All of it pouring out now unchecked, though his whole body had finally refused to carry the weight alone. He walked out of the study without a backward glance, crossing the halls of the executive offices at a near run, until he ran into Grace in the lobby, alarmed by the sound of the slammed door. "Caleb, what's going on? I'm leaving," he said, his voice raw. "Tonight." "What? Why?" "Because I'm nothing in this house except a tool for your grandfather's guilty conscience. Because this marriage, this kindness, this family that supposedly took me and all of it is built on a lie even you didn't know about. I don't understand any of what you're saying. My father was destroyed by your family, Grace. Robbed, humiliated, thrown away like a broken part. And your grandfather knew it the entire time he was taking me in under his roof." Grace's face went still, caught between confusion and a grief, only just beginning to surface, while Caleb, without waiting for a response, headed for the door, his heart in pieces, carrying with him 28 years of silence that had finally painfully found its voice at the cost, perhaps, of everything he had begun without ever admitting it to himself to build inside this house. He swore he was leaving forever. Left standing alone in the lobby, Grace turned back toward her grandfather's study, her hands still trembling from the force of what she'd just witnessed. She found Robert sitting motionless behind his desk, his face carved with a grief far older than the 2 years she'd spent asleep. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. What he said. Robert didn't answer right away. He looked for a moment less like the man who had built an automotive empire from nothing, and more like an old man who had run out of ways to defend himself. "There are things I should have told you both a long time ago," he said finally. "I was afraid that if I did, I would lose the one thing I had left to hope for. You lied to him, Grandpa. To both of us. I know." His voice cracked on the words. "I know, Grace. And I don't expect either of you to forgive me for it tonight." She stood there a long moment, torn between the fury still burning in her chest and a strange, unexpected ache for the broken old man in front of her. The same tangle of loyalty and anger she imagined. Caleb must have carried his entire life, walking these halls. She said nothing more. She simply turned and walked out into the cold evening air toward the driveway where Caleb's taillights had already disappeared into the dark, wondering for the first time whether some kinds of silence really could be forgiven at all. At the same time, across the city in a cramped studio apartment, lit by a single desk lamp, Danny Doyle sat hunched over a stack of papers on his kitchen table, a mug of coffee gone cold beside him. Since the day Caleb had told him weeks back about the strange threats swirling around him, Grant's public humiliations, the whispers of business rivals circling like vultures, Dutch had made it his own quiet project to dig through whatever public records he could find on Ashford Auto Supply, the parts distribution arm of the Ashford family's business empire. He didn't fully know what he was looking for yet. He only knew with the stubborn instinct of a man who trusted his gut more than any lawyer that a family capable of the cruelty he'd watched them inflict on his best friend for 20 years was capable of a great deal more than cruelty. He turned another yellowed invoice over in his hands, frowning at a supplier code he didn't recognize, and set it carefully aside in a growing pile, not knowing yet that somewhere in that pile of paper waited a truth that would change both their lives forever. Caleb didn't go home to his mother that night. He couldn't face her, couldn't tell her he'd broken the silence she'd begged him to keep the night before the wedding. He wandered for hours through the frozen streets of Detroit, no real direction in mind, letting the cold bite at his face, as if it might numb even a little the ache tearing through his chest. Darkened storefronts slid past him indifferent, while the wind cut between the old brick buildings with a low, mournful whistle. His feet carried him almost against his own will to the small garage his father had once leased an address he knew by heart from copying it 1,000 times, as a boy off old invoices tucked away in his mother's things, an address he had never once had the courage to visit. The place, converted now into a modest tire shop, was locked up for the night. Caleb sat down on the front step in the cold knees pulled to his chest and stayed there for hours, watching his own breath turn to fog under the dim glow of a street lamp. He thought of his father, of that broad hand once guiding his own over a pencil of a life stolen by silence and injustice, and for the first time in years he let the tears come without holding them back, without anyone there to see. The next morning a light snow had settled over the rooftops of the city, silent, almost gentle in its whiteness. Grace, who hadn't slept a wink all night, pushed the household staff for answers until an old company address ledger buried in the archives turned up the street where Walter Marsh's old workshop had once stood. She went alone without telling her grandfather, wrapped in a coat far too thin for the biting cold, guided by an instinct she couldn't fully explain even to herself. She found him sitting against the locked door, eyes red, rimmed, his face marked by a full night spent outdoors. He didn't hear her approach at first, lost in a blank, exhausted stare at the snow-covered sidewalk. "Caleb," He looked up, startled, almost ashamed to be caught in a moment of such rawness, a man who had spent his whole life learning to hide his pain behind an unshakable composure. "You shouldn't have come. It's too cold for you out here. You have every right to be angry," she said, ignoring the comment entirely, sitting down beside him on the frozen step without a thought for the hem of her coat dragging in the snow. "But if you walk away now, if you leave all of this behind you, let the people who crushed your father win. You don't understand what this feels like, Grace." His voice cracked slightly on her name, which he rarely said without the distance of a title between them. Growing up knowing that your name alone closes doors before you've even opened your mouth. Watching your mother get down on her knees on floors she wasn't allowed to walk on any other way. Finding out at 28 that your father died with a broken heart because of a lie everybody knew except you. Grace stayed quiet for a long moment, her gaze lost on the snow-covered street, before answering, her voice strangely calm, almost fragile. "You think you're the only one carrying a wound nobody can see, Caleb." She pulled her coat tighter around herself, searching for the words. "For 2 years I heard voices around me and couldn't answer any of them. I heard my grandfather crying at night when he thought I was alone. I heard doctors talking about me like I was a file, a case number, a percentage of odds. Sometimes I heard people from the company worrying not about whether I'd wake up, but about what would happen to their shares if I never did." She paused, her voice trembling. "For 2 years, Caleb, I was a number on a balance sheet. Nobody before you ever talked to me like a human being. You'd sit next to me and tell me about the cold winters of your childhood, the sketches you drew at night, your father's name that you didn't know how to carry yet. You didn't know I could hear you, but I felt it. It was the first time since the accident that I felt seen. Not managed. Not protected like property. Seen." She looked down at her own hands, still faintly unsteady. "I remember the day you told me you used to sleep buried under every blanket in the apartment, while your mother froze under a single shawl because she wouldn't let you feel the cold. I couldn't move, I couldn't cry, but something in me broke that day for a stranger I'd never even seen. Maybe that's what finally woke me up. Not any prophecy. Just the certainty somewhere deep down that a good man was waiting for me on the other side of all that sleep." Caleb turned to look at her, stunned, his throat too tight to answer right away. "You taught me how to feel human again," she went on, her eyes bright. "Let me do the same for you. Let me be the one who sees you past the Marsh name, past your father's wound, past everything this city ever made you carry alone." Something in Caleb broke open at that moment. Not a new wound, but a damn 12 years old holding back tears. He had never once believed he had the right to shed in front of anyone. He pressed his face into his hands, his shoulders shaking with an emotion he no longer tried to contain, and he told her for the first time since it happened about Mia. He told her about being 16, about the brakes he'd fixed with parts he couldn't really afford, about the icy morning on Fenkel Avenue, about the sound he still heard some nights before falling asleep. He told her he had never said any of it out loud before. Not to his mother, not to Dutch, not to a single living soul, because saying it made it real in a way that silence never had. Grace didn't offer him hollow comfort. She simply took his hand and said, "You didn't kill your sister, Caleb. You were a 16-year-old boy trying to save his whole family with everything you had. I should have found the money somewhere. I should have. You were a child carrying a grown man's weight," she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Nobody teaches a 16-year-old how to do that without breaking something. You've spent 12 years punishing yourself for trying to help the people you loved. That's not a crime, Caleb. That's grief wearing the mask of guilt." He looked at her, and for the first time he saw in her eyes no pity, no curiosity, none of the careful distance an heiress might keep toward a stranger, only a sincere, unguarded understanding born of two solitudes that had, without either of them realizing it, finally recognized each other. "Come back to the house," she said softly. "Not for my grandfather, not for the company. Come back for me. We'll find a way to give your father back his honor together, but not alone. Never alone again." They sat a long while longer on that frozen step in front of the old workshop in the biting cold of the winter morning, without another word passing between them, a silence that for the first time carried no anger and no suspicion, only something new, fragile, almost sacred. When they finally rose stiff from the cold, Caleb reached out a hand to help Grace to her feet, a simple gesture which she accepted without hesitation, their fingers holding on a beat longer than they needed to. "Thank you," he said, his voice still fragile. "For what?" "For seeing something in me besides a replacement, and for not looking away from the ugliest part of what I just told you." She smiled, a real smile, the first she'd ever given him, without a shadow of reservation behind it. "You were never a replacement, Caleb, and what you just told me doesn't make you a monster. It makes you the only person in this whole story who's never once lied about what he was really feeling." They walked back together toward the Whitmore estate, their footprints cutting twin lines through the fresh snow, while behind them the locked door of Walter Marsh's old workshop seemed for the first time in 28 years to be watching over a son finally ready to carry his name, his grief without shame. Caleb moved back into the Whitmore estate that same week, though something in him had shifted for good. The guarded distance he'd always kept from Grace had softened into something. Neither of them tried to name out loud yet, but Robert, watching them from across the breakfast table some mornings, noticed all the same with a quiet gratitude he didn't dare interrupt. Across town, Dutch Doyle kept working through his stack of records most nights after closing up the garage, a habit that had turned somewhere along the way from a favor for a worried friend into something closer to an obsession. He didn't fully understand yet what was pulling at him, only that every invoice bearing the Ashford Auto Supply letterhead left a faint sour taste in his mouth. He couldn't quite place something older than his distrust of Grant, Ashford's family. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, sorting through a box of old supplier records donated to the public library's local history archive by a defunct county garage association, that Dutch found the name that stopped his hand cold. On the page, a safety recall notice, dated 15 years back, for a batch of hydraulic floor jacks manufactured under contract for Ashford Auto Supply, flagged for a defect that could cause sudden catastrophic failure under load. Stapled behind it, an internal memo, its language dry and bureaucratic, noted that Ashford Auto Supply had opted to continue distributing the existing inventory rather than absorb the cost of a full recall, citing acceptable residual risk and a distribution deadline they didn't want to miss. Dutch sat with that phrase for a long moment. Acceptable residual risk. He knew that phrase. He had heard some version of it spoken far more clumsily from an insurance adjuster 15 years ago, standing in his mother's kitchen explaining why nobody would be held responsible for what had happened to Dutch's father. Marty Doyle had been a mechanic, same as his son would become, working the underside of a used Ford pickup in a rented garage bay on Detroit's west side, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when the jack beneath the vehicle gave way. Without warning, Dutch had been 13 years old, doing his homework at a workbench 20 feet away. He remembered the sound before he remembered anything else, a sound he had spent 15 years trying not to think about. He remembered his mother's face at the hospital. He remembered most of all the insurance company's letter months later explaining that the equipment manufacturer bore no established liability, that the matter was considered closed. He had grown up believing it was simply bad luck, a machine wearing out the ordinary cruelty of chance. He had never once imagined that somewhere in a filing cabinet a company had known in writing that the jack could fail and had chosen the deadline over the warning. His hands shook as he photocopied the pages at the library's front desk, the older woman behind the counter, throwing him a concerned glance he didn't have the composure to answer. He showed up at Caleb's workshop that evening, the folder gripped tight against his chest, his breath ragged despite every doctor's order not to overexert himself. Caleb bent over a delicate mechanism under the trembling light of his desk lamp, set his tools down the instant he saw his friend's face. "Dutch, what happened?" Dutch didn't answer right away. He stood in the doorway a moment, the folder trembling in his hands, before finally crossing the room and setting it down on the workbench without a word. Caleb opened it, scanned the recall notice, the internal memo, and felt his stomach drop as he understood what he was looking at. A heavy silence filled the small room, broken only by the steady ticking of the clocks lined up along the shelf. "Why?" Dutch asked at last, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you ever tell me what kind of people they really are?" 15 years, Caleb. 15 years I thought it was just bad luck. Turns out the same company that's been humiliating you your whole life is the one that killed my dad. I didn't know, Dutch. I swear to you I had no idea. I know you didn't. Dutch dropped into the workshop's single spare chair, his face in his hands. I spent so long telling you not to trust these people, warning you they'd use you and toss you aside. And this whole time I never once thought to ask what they'd already taken from me." Caleb crossed the small room and sat down beside his oldest friend, laying a hand on his shoulder. The same wordless gesture the two of them had traded back and forth since they were 7 years old. A gesture that had always carried more than either of them ever managed to say out loud. "You've been the one steady thing in my life since we were kids, Dutch," he said quietly. "My mom gave me my life. You gave me a reason to still believe in it on the days I had the least reason to." Dutch wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve still shaken, but a faint, real smile beginning to break through. "All those years I was so sure you were selling yourself out to these rich people. Turns out you and me were carrying the exact same wound the whole time, and neither one of us ever said a word." "Not anymore," Caleb said. "Whatever happens with the Ashfords now, we go after it together. Dutch let out a long breath, something in his chest finally loosening after 15 years of unspoken grief. Together he repeated like a promise. I mean it, Caleb. Whatever it takes to make this right for your dad, for my dad, for anyone else this family's cut corners on, I'm with you. The two of them stayed up long past midnight spreading the recall documents across the workbench, alongside Walter Marsh's old notebook, cross-referencing supplier codes, dates, distributor names, an unlikely partnership between a self-taught engineer and a stubborn backstreet mechanic, both of them driven now by something far more personal than curiosity. It was well past 2 in the morning when Dutch, rubbing his tired eyes, noticed something buried in a shipping manifest that made him go very still. Caleb, he said slowly. This routing code. It's the same supplier account number that shows up on the parts invoice for Miss Whitmore's car, the one from her accident. Caleb looked up sharply from the notebook in his hands. Say that again. Grace's accident, Caleb. The car she was driving. It used parts from the exact same supply chain. A cold, unfamiliar dread settled over the small workshop, the kind that made the two men look at each other in silence for a long moment. Neither one quite ready yet to say out loud what they were both beginning independently to suspect. That could still be a coincidence, Caleb said finally, though his own voice didn't sound convinced of it. Ashford Auto Supply's parts probably ended up in half the vehicles in this state. It doesn't mean anything on its own. Maybe not, Dutch admitted. But you and I both know that in this family, coincidence has a bad habit of turning out to be something else entirely. They agreed before the night was over to keep digging quietly without a word to Robert or Grace, yet not until they had something solid enough to stand on, something that couldn't be dismissed as grief looking for someone to blame. Caleb walked home to the Whitmore estate as the sky over Detroit began to lighten into that same bruised gray he'd watched from his father's garage steps only days before the recall folder tucked carefully inside his jacket. He found Diane already awake in the estate's kitchen when he stopped by that morning to check on her. Robert had insisted weeks earlier on having her driven over for breakfast whenever she wanted it, an arrangement she still hadn't quite gotten used to accepting. He told her gently about Marty Doyle, about the recall, about the strange, aching symmetry of two families, both broken by the same kind of silence. Diane set down her coffee cup, her weathered hands trembling slightly. That poor woman, she murmured, thinking of Dutch's mother, a woman she'd known in passing for 30 years without ever knowing the true weight she carried. All this time, and none of us knew the real reason. Neither did Dutch, Caleb said quietly. Not until last night. She reached across the table and took her son's hand the same way she had the night before his wedding, and said nothing more because some truths she had learned long ago didn't need more words piled on top of them to be understood. A few weeks later, the first hard frost of the season had given way to a low gray winter sky, the kind that hung over Detroit each year just before the industry's most anticipated event. The Detroit Concours held that year in the restored ballroom of the old Book Cadillac Hotel, downtown. Every major name in the American automotive world turned out for it. Collectors, engineers, journalists, and old money families who came as much for business as for the chance to be seen. Since their morning together outside Walter Marsh's old workshop, something had settled between Caleb and Grace that neither of them had tried to put into words yet, though the questions that still hung unresolved about Robert, about the truth Caleb had learned, hadn't disappeared entirely, either. An unspoken agreement seemed to have formed between them to let that particular wound heal at its own pace without forcing a confrontation neither of them felt ready for. But their silences had changed character. They were no longer built from suspicion. They were built from a fragile, careful trust, like a first thaw after a winter that had gone on too long. Robert had insisted that Grace and Caleb attend the Concours together, as the official representatives of Whitmore Motor Company. Everyone already knows you're awake, sweetheart, he'd told his granddaughter. Better they see you strong standing beside your husband than left to whisper their own version of the story. Caleb had agreed, though he did a poor job hiding his own unease about it. He had never worn a suit before the one at his own wedding. This time, Robert had insisted on having one tailored for him, and Caleb, standing in front of his bedroom mirror, barely recognized the man staring back. Shoulders squared, the dark fabric fitted with a precision he'd never known clothing could have, and yet underneath all of it the same old exhaustion still sitting behind his eyes. The same quiet vigilance of a man who had never once had the luxury of feeling fully safe. The ballroom was already alive with the low hum of conversation and clinking glassware by the time they arrived. Crystal chandeliers throwing warm light across a room packed with the most prestigious names in American automotive engineering. Grace, radiant in a deep navy gown, kept a firm grip on Caleb's arm, feeling beneath her fingers the tension coiled through his entire body. "You don't have anything to prove tonight," she murmured to him. "You're my husband." That's enough. Easy for you to say, he answered with a nervous half-smile before catching himself. For you to say. They had barely crossed the room when a voice too loud, too self-assured rose up behind them. Well, would you look who it is? The garage boy turned son-in-law. Grant Ashford stood there, a glass of champagne in hand, flanked by two acquaintances already laughing before he'd even finished his sentence. I sure hope you know how to hold a champagne flute properly, Caleb. Wouldn't want you mistaking it for a dish rag. An uncomfortable silence rippled outward through the surrounding crowd, several heads turning toward the scene. Caleb felt his stomach knot with that same old familiar humiliation, the same burn he remembered from the Ashford driveway all those weeks ago. Grant, that's enough. Grace cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. Wasn't talking to you, Grace. Though I do wonder how a Whitmore ended up marrying. This. A woman stepped forward, then elegant, her smile a shade too polished to be sincere, Brooke Ferris, whom Caleb recognized instantly, his chest tightening with a mixture of old hurt and instinctive wariness. Caleb, she said, feigning surprise. It's been so long. You've really changed. Her gaze slid over his tailored suit with a thinly veiled contempt. Or maybe not as much as I thought. The words landed like a slap. Caleb thought of his mother, of his father, of all the years these kinds of words had tried and always failed to break him completely. He remembered fleetingly a time he'd believed he loved this woman an afternoon years ago, when he'd shown her his first engineering sketches in secret before she'd dismissed them as cute hobbies for a poor kid, and turned instead toward the far safer fortune of the Ashford name. He clenched his fists, searching in the forced calm of his own breathing for the strength not to answer with the anger boiling underneath. I never expected anything from either of you, he said finally, his voice low but perfectly controlled. So save yourselves the trouble. Such dignity, Grant sneered. That's new for a Marsh. Grace, who had watched the whole exchange with a fury building steadily in her chest, stepped forward, her voice suddenly carrying an authority few people in that room had ever heard from her before. That's enough, Grant. She placed herself squarely in front of Caleb, her gaze unwavering. You refused to marry me when I was in a coma. You called my condition a public embarrassment. And now you have the nerve to insult the man who actually chose to treat me with respect, while I couldn't even open my eyes. The room fell into a heavier silence this time. Heads turned. A visible shift moved through the crowd, the quiet, unmistakable sound of public opinion, until now hesitant, finally choosing a side. This man, Grace, went on, her voice trembling with conviction, sat beside my bed every single day, and never once demanded anything from me. He slept on the floor out of respect. He talked to me while I was asleep like I was a human being, not a contract to be honored. And you two think you can stand here tonight and treat him like a dog in front of all of Detroit? Brooke looked away, her earlier confidence visibly faltering. Grant tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow, unsupported now by anyone around him. It was at that moment that the concours director, a composed, gray-haired man named Arthur Lawson, approached, his expression grave. He had watched the entire scene unfold, along with a good portion of the room. Mr. Ashford, he said, his voice calm but firm. This kind of behavior has no place in this establishment. I'll have to ask the Ashford family to leave the premises. And I'm afraid this incident is likely to weigh heavily on your standing at future events hosted by our association. You can't be serious, Grant stammered, the color draining from his face. My father has contracts with half the companies in this room tonight. He did, Lawson cut in before turning and walking away. Grant stood frozen a moment, the champagne glass trembling slightly in his hand before storming out of the room, Brooke trailing behind him under the silent stares of dozens of people who only minutes earlier had been laughing along with him. Caleb, who had stood motionless through the entire scene, felt an unfamiliar warmth rise through him. Not joy exactly, but something deeper and rarer. The sensation for the first time in his life of having been defended publicly without condition by someone who had nothing to gain from it. You didn't have to do that, he murmured to Grace once the crowd had dispersed, his voice still unsteady with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Yes, I did, she answered, simply slipping her hand into his. I needed to just as much as you did. Walking toward the exit, Caleb felt the room's eyes follow them, no longer heavy with contempt or curious pity, but with something new, almost respectful, as though the scene that had just played out had in a matter of minutes rewritten everything Detroit thought it knew about him. He thought of his mother, to whom he would tell this story carefully, choosing his words so as not to overwhelm her, and of his father, who he wished more than anything could have witnessed just once a moment when the name Marsh no longer meant shame but dignity restored. They left the concourse together under the still stunned gaze of the crowd, while across the city in the cold Detroit night, The Ashford family's reputation had already begun quietly to come apart at the seams, the first tremor of a collapse that neither Grant nor his father would see coming, until it was far too late. In the weeks that followed the concours, the Ashford family's collapse gathered speed with a swiftness nobody, least of all Caleb, could have predicted. One by one, business partners withdrew, citing vague contractual clauses or simple, polite excuses to distance themselves from a name that had become almost overnight synonymous with public scandal. The great automotive houses of Detroit, once so eager to court the Ashfords for their connections, turned away from them now, with the same speed they'd once used to court them. The family estate, once full of loud parties and louder laughter, slowly emptied of the household staff. No one could afford to keep paying, while Richard Ashford, unrecognizable, now spent his days shut away in his study combing through ledgers he already knew deep down were beyond saving. Caleb, hearing about this slow ruin secondhand through the whispers that traveled fast in Whitmore Motor Company's circles, felt a strange, uneasy churn of emotion torn between a satisfaction he didn't fully want to admit to himself and a discomfort at the sheer scale of the fall. He had never wished ruin on anyone, only someday justice. But justice, he was starting to learn, rarely looked the way anyone imagined it, and often left behind far more wreckage than expected. One evening, as Caleb walked home from the workshop, he still kept tucked away in a corner of the estate's back gardens. A familiar figure was waiting for him under a street lamp, hands buried in the pockets of a coat that had once looked elegant and now seemed simply wrinkled, almost neglected. "Grant, I'm not here to fight, Caleb," he said, his voice strangely calm, stripped of the arrogance that usually colored it. "I came to offer you a deal." Caleb stopped, wary. "What kind of deal?" "Divorce, Grace." Grant pulled a thick envelope from inside his jacket and held it out. "There's enough in here to set you and your mother up somewhere far from Detroit. You'd never have to worry about money again." Caleb looked at the envelope without touching it, disgust and disbelief twisting together in his stomach. "You really think everything in life can be bought?" "Everything can be bought, Caleb. You've just never had the money to find that out for yourself." "Then let me teach you something money never did." Caleb answered, his voice level but sharp as a blade. "Some things aren't for sale. Grace isn't one of them. Take your money and don't come back." Grant stood there a moment, stunned, before a bitter, twisted smile crossed his face. "You'll regret turning me down, Caleb Marsh. Trust me on that." He turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind him a silence heavy with an unspoken threat. A few days later, crossing the courtyard outside Whitmore Motor Company's headquarters, a hesitant voice called out to Caleb from the shadow of a support column. "Caleb, please." Brooke stood there, her features drawn, her clothes far less polished than the ones she'd worn at the concours. Her position at one of Detroit's most respected design firms, he learned quickly, had been terminated the moment the scandal splashed her name across the local papers, tied publicly now to the Ashfords' disgrace. "I've lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "My job. Soon my apartment if I can't make rent. People who used to invite me everywhere won't even answer my texts anymore." "What do you want me to do about it?" Caleb asked, without cruelty but without warmth either. "Talk to Grace. Ask her to drop it or to put in a word with Director Lawson. Please. You of all people know what it feels like to lose everything." Caleb studied her for a long moment, this woman he had once loved with the clumsy fervor of youth, before she'd left him for a name more prestigious than his own. He felt no real anger toward her now, only a quiet, distant sadness. "I know what it's like to lose everything, Brooke. I've known it since the day I was born. The difference is I never had the luxury of blaming someone else for my poverty. You chose to leave me for the Ashford money. Today you're paying the price for that choice. I'm sorry for you, but there's nothing I can do." "You've gotten so cold," she murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "No," he answered gently, almost with compassion. "I've just stopped carrying the weight of other people's choices." He walked away, leaving her alone beneath the column, her face carrying a confusion she couldn't quite name, something that felt, though she didn't dare admit it, far closer to genuine remorse than the simple loss of her old life. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, an ambitious businessman named Craig Sutton watched the Ashfords collapse and Caleb Marsh's quiet rise within Whitmore Motor Company with growing interest. Craig, newly arrived in Detroit's closed circle of automotive elite, had spent months trying to find a way into a far more exclusive world, the small handful of people who could claim any real connection to the mysterious anonymous restorer. The whole industry had come to call, with a kind of hushed respect, the Motor City Ghost, a craftsman whose restored engines and custom builds fetched extraordinary sums, though no one had ever seen his face. "Word is he lives right here in Detroit," Craig confided to a business associate over a private dinner. And this Marsh kid, the unlikely son-in-law of the Whitmores, he's known to work with backstreet mechanics all over this city. He's got to know somebody who can get me in front of the ghost. And if the kid won't cooperate, Craig smiled, cold and calculating. Everybody's got a price, especially people who've never had one before. The next day, Craig arrived at Whitmore Motor Company under the pretext of a routine business visit, catching Caleb alone in the gardens. "Mr. Marsh," he said, his handshake a beat too firm, his smile a beat too wide. "I've heard a great deal about you. A humble man, they say, who knows this city's backstreet garage scene better than anyone. What can I do for you, Mr. Sutton? Word is you might have a way to reach the Motor City Ghost. I'd love to arrange an introduction. I can be very generous about it." Caleb felt a strange chill run through him, not fear but a dizzying irony he couldn't yet explain to this man standing in front of him. "I'm afraid I can't help you there, Mr. Sutton. Think it over. The offer I'm making could change your life, yours and your mother's." Caleb looked at him a long moment, feeling a familiar weariness settle over him at the sight of yet another man who believed a person's poverty could simply be negotiated like any other piece of merchandise. "I'll think about it," he said, without much conviction, before turning to leave. As he walked away, he couldn't help a small, secret, almost bitter smile at the irony of it all. This man was trying to bribe the one intermediary he never actually needed, because the Motor City Ghost and Caleb Marsh had from the very beginning been one and the same person. But that secret, however tempting it might have been to use it to silence men so full of their own importance, remained for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself. A burden he wasn't ready to set down in front of the world. Maybe deep down he feared that revealing that name would only reawaken the old wounds of his father, that success once dragged into the light might once again draw out the same jealousy, the same theft that had cost Walter Marsh everything a generation before. That same week, a fact long buried finally surfaced through Dutch's continued digging. The man who had cheated Walter Marsh out of his life's work decades ago, the business partner history had quietly erased, was named Roy Ferris, Brooke's own father. As the pieces came together, Caleb understood with a bitterness that settled deep in his chest that the woman who had once abandoned him for a wealthier name was, without ever knowing it herself, the daughter of the very man who had destroyed his father's life. Evening fell over Detroit, and in the gathering shadow of the Whitmore Motor Company courtyard, two separate threats, one desperate, born of a ruined family with nothing left to lose, the other cold and calculating, born of a stranger's hunger for recognition, began, without Caleb's knowledge, to move steadily toward the same breaking point. Dutch didn't let the thread go. Every evening after closing the garage, he sat with Caleb in the small workshop behind the Whitmore estate, the two of them working late under the trembling glow of the desk lamp, cross-referencing supplier codes, shipment dates, distributor names, with a patience neither of them had known they possessed. What had begun as a search for justice for Dutch's father had quietly widened into something far larger, far more dangerous, neither of them fully willing yet to say out loud. It was Dutch who found it close to midnight on an otherwise ordinary Thursday, buried 3 folders deep in a stack of photocopied service records he'd requested on a hunch from the Michigan Department of Transportation's Public Safety Archive. "Caleb." His voice had gone very quiet. "You need to see this." Caleb crossed the room and looked down at the document in Dutch's hands, a manufacturer recall notice dated just 11 days before Grace Whitmore's accident, flagging a defective brake line component installed in a batch of vehicles that included the exact model and year of the car Grace had been driving that night. Beneath it, a second document, a dealership service log showing the recall had been formally logged into the system, scheduled, and then, without explanation, marked "Canceled owner. Declined service 4 days before the crash." Grace never declined anything, Caleb said slowly, a cold dread creeping up his spine. She wasn't even the one who managed her own car's service appointments back then. Her assistant handled all of that. Then who canceled it? They found the answer an hour later, cross-referencing the dealership's internal records against the notarized cancellation form, buried in a digitized batch of old paperwork the dealership had, out of sheer bureaucratic laziness, never bothered to purge from its servers. The cancellation had been authorized under the name G.A. Whitmore, a signature meant at a glance to pass for an assistant's shorthand, or perhaps a careless clerical error. But Caleb, staring at the looping, distinctive slant of that final letter A, felt something in him go cold and still. "I've seen this handwriting before," he said quietly. "On the guest book at the concours. It's Grant's." They sat with that for a long moment, neither of them speaking, the small workshop suddenly feeling too quiet, too close. Dutch was the one who finally said what they were both circling. Why would Grant cancel a safety recall on Grace's car 11 days before she wrapped it around a guardrail? Caleb's mind raced back through everything Robert had ever told him offhand, in passing the kind of detail nobody thinks to weigh until it matters. Grant Ashford, born on the same day as Grace, had always occupied a strange, quiet position in the Whitmore family's extended orbit. Not blood, but close enough through decades of business ties and family friendship that Robert had once, years ago, named him as a contingency successor in an early draft of his estate planning, back before Grace herself had come of age to take the reins. It was a detail long since revised, long since forgotten by everyone, except perhaps the one person who had never stopped counting on it. He thought he still had a shot at the company, Caleb said, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. If Grace never woke up, if she'd never even survived, there was a version of Robert's estate plan years old that still named him. He wasn't just careless with that recall, Dutch. He made sure it disappeared. Dutch's face had gone pale. That's not negligence, Caleb. That's attempted murder. Neither of them slept that night. By morning, they had assembled everything. The recall notice, the cancellation form, the handwriting comparison. A timeline laid out in Caleb's own careful engineer's hand into a single folder, and they carried it together to Robert Whitmore's study, where the old man sat as he so often did, now reviewing correspondence in the pale winter light. Mr. Whitmore, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. There's something you need to see. Robert listened without interrupting, as Caleb laid it all out document by document, his usually composed hands beginning to tremble somewhere around the third page. When Caleb finally set down the cancellation form pointing to the looping signature at the bottom, Robert went utterly still, the color draining slowly from his face. I know his handwriting, he said, barely above a whisper. I've seen it on 100 birthday cards, on his father's business letters. I know it. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly. I know what he's meant to this family. Robert didn't answer right away. He sat with the folder open on his desk, staring at it the way a man stares at a wound he hadn't realized until just now was still bleeding. I brought that boy to Christmas dinners for 20 years, he said, finally, his voice hollow. I once told Eleanor I hoped he and Grace would grow up close like cousins. And this whole time, his voice broke off entirely. We don't know everything yet, Caleb offered, though even he could hear how little comfort the words carried. But we know enough that this can't stay buried. Robert closed his eyes, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. The same steady sound Caleb had once found strange comfort in sitting beside Grace's bed through too long. Years of silence, now marking out a very different kind of reckoning. Call the police, Robert said at last, his voice regaining slowly some of its old iron. And call my attorney. If what you're telling me is true, my granddaughter has been living under the same roof as the man who tried to take her from us, and I let him walk through my front door every single time he asked. Grace found them there an hour later, drawn by the unusual quiet that had settled over the house, and Caleb, with a gentleness he'd never had to summon for anything harder in his life, told her everything. He watched her face move through disbelief, then horror, then a controlled, deliberate calm that frightened him more than tears would have. He tried to kill me, she said finally, very quietly, as though testing the shape of the words for the first time. Not just refused to marry me. He tried to make sure I never woke up at all. We don't know that for certain yet, Caleb said, though his own voice offered little conviction. But the evidence points that direction, and we're not going to let it disappear. Dutch, who had stayed by the study door out of a rough sense of not wanting to intrude, spoke up. Then his voice quieter than Caleb had ever heard it. For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, I know exactly what it feels like. Finding out a piece of paper somebody signed years ago is the reason somebody you love almost didn't make it home. I'm sorry you're finding that out today, too. Grace looked at him, something like recognition passing between them, two people strangers until a few months ago now, bound by the same quiet, furious grief. Thank you, she said simply, and meant it. Grace looked down at the folder still open on her grandfather's desk, at the looping signature that had in the space of one morning turned the boy she'd known her whole life into someone she no longer recognized at all. She reached for Caleb's hand without a word, and he took it, holding on the way a person holds on to something solid in the middle of an earthquake, because whatever came next, neither of them intended to face it alone. Outside, snow had begun falling again over the rooftops of Detroit, quiet and indifferent, while inside the Whitmore estate a storm far more dangerous than any winter weather was only just beginning to gather, one that would within days bring Grant Ashford's carefully constructed world crashing down around him for good. Word moved fast once Robert's attorney filed the first report with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. Within 2 days, Grant Ashford understood through a phone call from a lawyer, who no longer sounded quite so loyal, that a criminal investigation had opened in his name, evidence tampering at minimum with the possibility of far graver charges still being weighed. Cornered, stripped of the family fortune that had always cushioned every consequence in his life, Grant Ashford had, for the first time, nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose, Caleb would come to understand in the hours that followed, is the most dangerous kind of man there is. That evening, as Diane Marsh walked home alone from the corner grocery on the east side, a paper bag of groceries balanced against her hip, a dark sedan slowed beside her on the empty street. Two men climbed out quickly, one of them pulling his hood low over his face. She didn't have time to cry out before a firm hand closed around her arm, shoving her toward the open car door without ceremony, the grocery bag bursting open on the pavement, sending a few apples rolling absurdly calm into the empty gutter. Caleb got the call an hour later, still bent over the mechanism he planned to unveil at the coming year's concours, working late in the small workshop behind the estate. The number on his phone wasn't one he recognized. Caleb Marsh said, a voice he knew immediately, despite its low, deliberately roughened tone. "I've got something that belongs to you, Grant." The blood in Caleb's veins went instantly to ice. "What did you do?" "Your mother's just fine. For now. Whether that stays true is entirely up to you. Come alone to the old distribution warehouse off Connor Street. 1 hour. Call anybody, and you'll regret it." The line went dead. Caleb stood frozen a moment, the phone trembling in his hand, a wave of pure animal panic sweeping through every part of him, that same old familiar terror, the one he had carried since he was 16 years old, the fear never quite spoken, aloud, that the world would someday find a way to take from him, the one person who had never once let him down. "Mom," he whispered before bolting from the workshop. Grace found him in the front hall, wrestling frantically into his coat, his face drained of all color. "Caleb, what's going on?" "Grant's got my mother. I have to go alone." "Alone? Are you out of your mind? We need to call the police. My grandfather, no." His voice cracked sharper than he meant it to be. "He said if I call anybody, he'll—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his throat closing around the words. "I can't take that risk, Grace. I'm begging you, let me go. Caleb, please. Don't ask me to just stand here and do nothing. I'm asking you to." He pressed a trembling hand to her cheek, a brief gesture, but one carrying everything he didn't have time left to say. "Please, stay here." He left the estate at a run, leaving Grace frozen in the front hall, her heart pounding with a fear she refused, despite the promise she'd just made under duress, to simply sit through in silence. The instant his car pulled away, she was already reaching for her own keys and dialing the county sheriff's non-emergency line with a hand that shook only slightly. The old distribution warehouse sat at the edge of the city, dark and silent, under a moon half hidden behind low clouds. Caleb picked his way carefully between rusted shelving units and abandoned pallet racks, his heart slamming against his ribs, until he spotted at the far end of the building his mother tied to a folding chair, her face marked with fear, but unharmed. "Mom, don't come any closer, honey," she called out, her voice breaking. "He's got a—" Quiet Grant cut in, stepping out from the shadows, a box cutter gripped in one hand, more out of desperate bravado than any real intent to use it. "Caleb, finally, let her go. It's me you want. Your whole life you took everything that was supposed to be mine," Grant spat. "The Whitmore name, the fortune, a respect you never earned. I never took anything from you, Grant. I only refused to walk away when you demanded it. Then give her up. Divorce Grace. Publicly. Tell everyone you never loved her, that you only married her for her money. Do that, and I'll let you both walk out of here. You want me to lie to save your bruised pride. I want you to pay for everything you've cost me." Grant's voice cracked, revealing beneath the rage something far rawer, the panic of a man who had staked his entire identity on a name, to a fortune, a reputation, and now found himself stripped of all. Three at once. It was at that moment that Grace, who had followed Caleb's car at a careful distance, despite the promise she'd made, despite the danger, burst through the warehouse's side door, startling Grant enough that his grip on the blade jerked wildly in the chaos of the moment. "Caleb, no!" Diane cried out. "Grace, get back!" Caleb shouted in the same instant, throwing himself instinctively between her and the blade, which caught her side in the confusion, shallow but enough to draw a bright line of blood across her pale coat. Grace staggered, one hand pressed to her side, her face suddenly ashen. Grant, horrified by what he'd just done, backed away, the blade slipping from his shaking hand before he turned, and fled into the night without a single glance behind him, leaving chaos in his wake that he would never again be able to undo. Caleb caught her before she could collapse, fully holding her against him, while Diane, freed at last from her bindings, was already dialing for help with a trembling voice. "Stay with me," Caleb murmured, his own voice breaking on every word, both hands pressed against her side to slow the bleeding. "Stay with me, please." "I'm here," Grace breathed, a faint smile despite the pain. "I told you, I wasn't going to let you carry this alone." The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens tearing through the frozen silence of the night. Caleb, refusing to let go of Grace's hand, even as they lifted her onto the gurney, climbed into the vehicle beside her, while Diane, shaken but unharmed, promised through tears to call Robert the moment she reached a phone. At the hospital, in the sterile hallway where he was made to wait, Caleb sat collapsed in a plastic chair, his face buried in his hands, unable to hold back the tears, finally falling unrestrained for the first time since anyone but Grace had seen him break. "She's going to be fine, mister," Marsh, a nurse, assured him gently before hurrying off. The wound was shallow. She was lucky. Caleb closed his eyes, an overwhelming relief, mixing with a new burning resolve. When they finally let him into her room, he crossed slowly to the bed where Grace lay pale but conscious, and leaned close, murmuring at last the words he had never once let himself say out loud. "I love you, Grace. No lie left between us. No calculation. You've become the one place my heart finally feels safe." She smiled weakly, her fingers curling around his. "I know, Caleb. I've known since the night you slept on the floor to protect my silence." Robert arrived soon after, his face wrecked with worry, and nearly broke down entirely at the sight of his granddaughter conscious and out of danger. He gripped Caleb's hand with a wordless gratitude that no sentence could have carried, while Diane, seated quietly in the corner of the room, watched the whole scene through silent tears, thinking of how strangely sometimes life found the way to mend with one hand what it had broken with the other. Outside, the long Detroit night slowly gave way to a pale, cold dawn, but for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, it arrived carrying a light that neither fear nor vengeance nor silence would have the power to put out. Grant Ashford was arrested 3 days later at a motel just outside Ann Arbor, found by state police less than 24 hours after Robert Whitmore's attorney filed the full evidence package with the Wayne County prosecutor's office. The charges stacked quickly, one on top of another: kidnapping, assault, evidence tampering, and at the center of it all, a charge of reckless endangerment tied directly to the buried recall notice on Grace's car, a charge the prosecutor's office made clear in a statement to the local news they intended to pursue with everything the law allowed. What remained of the Ashford family's empire did not survive the headlines that followed. Richard Ashford's remaining business partners severed every last tie within the week, and the family that had once employed Diane Marsh to scrub its marble floors quietly finally disappeared from the pages of Detroit society altogether, not through public shaming this time, but through the far more permanent weight of a courtroom. Grace healed slowly but completely, the thin scar along her side becoming over the weeks that followed less a wound and more a quiet, private reminder of a night that had, in its own terrible way, sealed something between her and Caleb that neither doubt nor fear would ever fully unsettle again. She spent long evenings beside him in the small workshop behind the estate, watching his hands move with patient precision over the mechanism he intended to present at last under his own true name at the coming year's concours. Robert, for his part, welcomed the relationship between his granddaughter and his son-in-law, with a relief tangled up in a guilt he still carried quietly, working in small and constant ways to make right the silence he had kept for far too long, though he never once tried to force a conversation about it before either of them was ready. "You should go," Grace told him one evening as he sat hesitating over the nearly finished piece. "Under your real name this time, or at least under the name the whole industry already admires without knowing it. And if they find out the Motor City Ghost is just a housekeeper's son," he asked, the old fear surfacing despite himself. "Then the world finds out that talent has never once cared about a person's last name or their bank account," she answered firmly, resting her hand over his. "Your father earned this. So did you." On the night of the presentation, the grand ballroom of the Detroit Institute of Automotive Arts glittered under 100 chandeliers. The finest names in the industry gathered around a central stage where the year's finalist restorations would be unveiled one by one. Caleb, dressed simply, felt his heart pound with an old familiar anxiety, but also for the first time with a pride he no longer tried to hide. His piece was unveiled to sustained applause, a suspension and transmission system of rare elegance, a quiet tribute to the region's own engineering traditions reimagined with a boldness few contemporary craftsmen still dare attempt. The evening's jury chair, a sharp-eyed, famously exacting woman named Eleanor Vance, lingered over the mechanism, visibly moved. Remarkable work, mister. She paused, smiling at the mystery. Forgive me. The Motor City Ghost, I believe you're known as. It was in that same moment that the full truth, already gathering weight for weeks in the local papers, was formally confirmed. Before the room, the legendary anonymous craftsman whose work the whole industry had quietly admired for years was Caleb Marsh, son of Walter Marsh, the engineer. This same industry had once erased entirely from its own history. A hush swept the room, followed seconds later by a wave of applause that built steadily from the front rows to the back, cresting into something closer to a standing ovation than any polite golf clap the evening had seen before. Robert Whitmore, standing near the stage, took the microphone with hands that trembled not from age this time, but from an emotion he no longer had any interest in hiding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clear across the ballroom, "tonight we are not simply honoring a gifted engineer. We are correcting a debt this company has owed for 28 years. He turned to Caleb. "Walter Marsh's name will be added permanently to the founder's wall at Whitmore Motor Company alongside my own father's, and a new commemorative line of vehicles will carry his name forward, so that this city never forgets what it once tried to erase." Caleb, overwhelmed, found Grace and Dutch in the crowd, both of them beaming with a pride that needed no words. He thought of his mother waiting at home, whom he would call the moment he stepped outside. He thought above everything else of his father, of a broad hand once guiding his own over a pencil of a debt finally, after 28 long years, repaid in full. Before the evening closed, Caleb took the microphone himself, his voice steady, despite the emotion still thick in his chest. "I want to tell you all something most of you don't know," he said. "When I was 16, I lost my little sister Mia in a car accident caused by a part I installed myself because our family couldn't afford the real one. I carried that guilt alone for 12 years, certain it made me unworthy of the very things I've built my life around: safety, precision, care. It took someone loving me, without flinching away from that truth, to teach me it wasn't a weakness to carry. It was grief, wearing guilt's mask. Tonight, in her memory, I'm founding the Mia Marsh Road Safety Initiative, a nonprofit that will provide free brake and safety inspections and free replacement parts to families across Michigan who can't afford them. No child should ever pay the price my sister paid simply because her family was poor." The room, moments ago, electric with celebration, fell into a different kind of silence. Now the hushed, respectful silence of people who understood they had just witnessed something rarer than talent: a man turning his own deepest wound into protection for strangers he would never meet. Alongside the initiative, Caleb announced the opening of a free trade school in his father's name, offering hands-on automotive and engineering education to underprivileged teenagers across Detroit, the same chance he himself had never been given, now handed forward to the next generation. A few months later, beneath the restored copper dome of Detroit's old Fisher Building, Caleb and Grace were married again, this time by their own free choice, with no prophecy, no blackmail, no shadow of obligation hanging over either of them. Grace wore a simple gown, joking that it suited an engineer's wife far better than any ball gown ever could. Caleb, in his jacket pocket, carried one of his father's old screwdrivers engraved with 2 initials, a quiet, essential way of letting Walter Marsh witness the day after all. Dutch stood as best man, raising his glass with a voice thick with emotion. "I met Caleb when we were 7 years old, sharing one busted bicycle between the two of us. I watched him carry more weight than any one person should ever have to carry alone: his father's, his mother's, and for longer than I ever knew, a piece of mine too, without ever once asking for anything back. Here's to the man who gives without needing anyone to know, who carried his family's whole broken legacy alone, and who finally found someone to carry it with him." In Grace's arms that night, Caleb realized for the first time in 12 years that he no longer heard the screech of brakes in the quiet moments before sleep. He only heard the steady, patient heartbeat of the woman who had taught him that love, however fragile, however easily it might be lost, was always worth giving fully one more time. This story leaves us with a simple but easily forgotten truth: a person's real worth is never measured by their bank balance, their family name, or where they came from, but by the kindness they choose to give, even when nobody is watching. Silence can protect for a while, but it always eventually grows heavier than the truth itself would have been. And real love, the kind that truly heals, isn't the kind that demands. It's the kind that sees a person exactly as they are, wounds and all, and chooses to stay anyway. This story also teaches us that quiet generosity, like the kind Caleb gave Dutch for years without ever asking for recognition, is worth infinitely more than money ever displayed out loud. It reminds us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, as Caleb showed even toward Brooke, but choosing to build something new despite the wound. And most of all, it shows us that the deepest kind of justice isn't the kind that punishes, It's the kind that repairs a name restored. A safety initiative in a little sister's memory, a school built from nothing but love. So we'd like to ask you, what lesson did you take from this story? Let us know in the comments section right below this video. We would truly love to hear what touched you the most. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it today, leave a comment telling us your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Thank you so much for staying with us through this whole journey, and we'll see you again in the next video. This story is a work of fiction created with the help of artificial intelligence. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.